The wind did not just blow across the high plains of the Nevada territory, it scoured them. It was a relentless, invisible hand that stripped the bark from the sagebrush and drove the grit of the earth into the deepest lines of a person's face. For Evelyn Ward, the wind was the only constant companion she had left. Her homestead sat 5 miles outside the town of Silver Creek, a solitary blister of gray wood on a landscape that was vast, brown, and indifferent to human suffering. To the west, the jagged teeth of the Sierra Nevada mountains bit into a sky that always felt too large, a vaulted ceiling of blinding blue that offered no shelter. To the east, the land rolled out into flat scrub and dust, broken only by the occasional twist of a dry creek bed. It was morning, or close enough to it. The light coming through the singled and warped glass window was pale and cold. Evelyn sat on the edge of her narrow rope bed, her hands gripping the quilt her grandmother had stitched in a happier life. Her heart was already hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She stood up. The floorboards groaned. First, the door. Evelyn walked to the heavy wooden door. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched the iron latch. It was seated firmly in its catch. She stared at it, her breath shallow. She stepped back, counted to 5 in her head, and then stepped forward again. She touched the latch a second time. It was still closed. She stepped back. She waited. The silence of the house pressed against her ears, filled only by the scratching of the wind outside. She stepped forward a third time, her fingers white as she gripped the cold metal, testing it, ensuring that the world outside could not get in and, more importantly, that nothing from inside could get out. 3 times. It had to be 3 times. If she did not check it 3 times, something terrible would happen. She did not know what, but the dread was a physical weight in her stomach. Satisfied, or at least exhausted by the ritual, she turned to the stove. This was the hardest part of the day. The cast iron stove stood in the corner, a black beast that demanded to be fed. Evelyn held a bundle of kindling in one hand and a lucifer match in the other. Her hands shook so badly that the dry twigs rattled. She struck the match against the rough stone of the hearth. It flared to life with a hiss and a sharp smell of sulfur. Evelyn froze. The tiny flame danced, yellow and blue. In her mind, the flame did not stay small. It roared. It climbed the curtains. It ate the ceiling. It screamed with a voice that sounded like a child. She dropped the match. It went out before it hit the floor, leaving a thin trail of gray smoke. Evelyn backed away, her back hitting the rough log wall. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands into her temples. "You have to eat," she told herself. The voice in her head was tired. "You have to heat the water." It took her 4 tries to light the stove. When the wood finally caught, crackling and popping, she stood by the door, ready to run, watching the firebox with the intensity of a wolf watching a trap. She could not look away until the heavy iron door was latched shut. Even then, the smell of wood smoke made her chest tighten, squeezing her lungs until she felt lightheaded. She was 26 years old, but looking in the cracked mirror above the wash basin, she saw a woman who looked 40. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was pulled back severely, but loose strands always escaped, whipping around her face like frantic thoughts. Her eyes were wide and skittish, forever scanning the corners of the room for danger. The townsfolk of Silver Creek did not see the fear. They only saw the result. They saw the widow who talked to herself. They saw the woman who walked down the street staring at her boots. They saw the monster who had survived the fire that took 2 innocent souls. Crazy Evelyn, the fire widow. She finished her meager breakfast of stale biscuits and tea, the silence of the house amplifying every swallow. She needed supplies. The flour sack was nothing but dust, and the coffee tin was empty. Going to town was a necessity, but it felt like a sentencing. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders. Though the day was already promising heat, the shawl was armor. She checked the stove 5 times to ensure the fire was truly out, dousing the warm ashes with water just to be certain, creating a hiss of steam that made her flinch. Stepping outside, the brightness of the sun assaulted her. The air smelled of sage and dry earth. She picked up the water pail from the porch, intending to fill it at the well before she left. So the animals, a single bony mule and a few scratching chickens, would have water while she was gone. A sound drifted on the wind. Crackle, snap. Evelyn stopped. The pail hung heavy in her hand. It was coming from the east, from the Miller property a mile away. A thin column of white smoke rose into the blue sky. Mr. Miller was burning brush, just clearing a field, a common, necessary chore in the West, but to Evelyn, it was the end of the world. The sound of the dry brush burning was too loud. It wasn't distant. It was right beside her ear. The snap of the wood became the snapping of roof beams. The heat of the sun on her neck became the blistering inferno of a collapsing wall. Suddenly, she was not standing by her well in the daylight. She was in the dark, choking on black smoke, the heat searing her skin. She heard the sound that haunted her sleep, a high, terrified wail. "Mama!" The scream tore through her mind. Sharp as a knife, Evelyn's fingers went numb. The heavy wooden bucket slipped from her grip and hit the hard-packed dirt with a dull thud. Water splashed over her boots and the hem of her dress, soaking into the dry ground instantly. She did not move. She could not move. She stood frozen, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, shaking so violently that her teeth chattered. Her eyes were fixed on the distant column of smoke, but she saw only the past. She saw the crib engulfed. She saw the roof coming down. She saw her own hands, blackened and useless. It took 10 minutes for the flashback to recede, leaving her drained and weeping silently in the yard. The wind dried the tears on her face, leaving tracks of salt. She looked down at the spilled water, the mud darkening the hem of her skirt. "I am broken," she thought. "I am nothing but ash holding a shape." But the flour bin was still empty, and if she did not eat, she would die. Perhaps that would be better. But the instinct to survive was a cruel, stubborn thing that refused to let her lie down and quit. She left the bucket where it lay and began the long walk to town. Silver Creek was bustling. It was the season when the cattle drives began to push north, and the town was swollen with ranch hands, drifters, and cowboys looking to spend their pay or find new work. Wagons churned the main street into a soup of dust and manure. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed men, horse sweat, and raw pine from the new construction expanding the saloon. Evelyn walked on the edge of the boardwalk, keeping her head down. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. If she focused on the number, she would not hear the noise. If she focused on the worn wood beneath her boots, she would not see the faces. She reached the general store and hesitated at the door. Taking a breath, she pushed inside. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that made her wince. The store was crowded. Women in calico dresses were inspecting bolts of fabric, and men were gathering around the counter discussing the price of barbed wire. The conversation faltered as Evelyn stepped in. A silence rippled outward from her, a cold wave in the warm room. She moved quickly to the dry goods section. Grabbing a sack of flour and a tin of coffee, she could feel the eyes on her back. They felt like insect stings. She approached the counter. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, was a man with a red face and a mustache that hid a perpetually frowning mouth. He was weighing sugar for Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife. Mrs. Gable turned, seeing Evelyn. She was a stout woman who wore her piety like a weapon. She instinctively pulled her young daughter closer to her skirts, as if Evelyn carried a contagion. "The Lord tests us with all manner of trials," Mrs. Gable said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry, "but he punishes the wicked with madness. It is a sign, sure as rain." Evelyn stared at the counter, her money clutching in her damp palm. She placed the flour and coffee down. "I would like these, please," Evelyn whispered. "Mr. Henderson did not look her in the eye. "That will be 40 cents. Mrs. Ward, and I cannot extend your credit any further. Cash only." "I have cash," she said, her voice trembling. She placed the coins on the wood. "Mr. Henderson swept them into his drawer with a quick, dismissive motion. He did not say thank you. He did not ask how she was. He simply looked over her shoulder to the next customer. Move along. Evelyn, he said, you are holding up the line. Evelyn grabbed her goods and turned. The walk to the door felt endless. She passed two ranch hands who were leaning against a barrel of apples. They stopped talking as she passed, watching her with a mixture of amusement and disgust. Crazy as a loon, that one. One of them muttered. She lit the fire, you know, the other whispered back. Burned her own man and boy alive. They say she sat on the porch and watched it happen. The lie was so old, so repeated, that it had become the town's truth. Evelyn pushed through the door, bursting back out into the harsh sunlight, gasping for air. The accusations echoed in her ears, louder than the street noise. She lit the fire. She watched, wicked. She began to walk fast, hugging the sack of flour to her chest like a shield. She needed to get home. She needed to be behind the door with the latch. The street was chaotic. A freight wagon dragged by a team of 6 oxen was rumbling down the center. Cowboys on skittish horses were weaving between pedestrians. The noise was a physical assault. Shouts, whinnies, the crack of whips, the grinding of iron wheels on stone. Evelyn's heart rate spiked. The panic she had held back in the store began to leak out. The dust in the air choked her. It smelled like smoke. No, she whispered. Not here. Please, not here. Suddenly, a shout rose above the din. Run away! Further up the street, a team of 2 massive bay horses hitched to a delivery wagon had spooked. The driver had lost the reins. The horses, eyes rolling white with terror, bolted. They tore down the main thoroughfare, the heavy wagon fishtailing behind them, smashing into a hitching post and sending splinters flying. People screamed and scrambled for the safety of the boardwalks. Evelyn looked up. The thunder of hooves vibrated through the soles of her boots. She saw the horses charging straight for her. They were a wall of muscle and terrified energy. But Evelyn did not see horses. As the team bore down on her, the dust they kicked up transformed. It became a cloud of billowing gray smoke. The sound of the hooves became the roar of the collapsing roof. The frantic motion of the animals became the chaotic dance of flames. She was back in the fire. Free's response took her. Her muscles locked. Her mind severed its connection to her legs. She stood dead center in the path of the stampede, clutching her sack of flour, her eyes wide and unseeing, staring into a hell that only she could see. Get out of the way! Someone screamed. She could not hear them. She could only hear the fire. The horses were 20 feet away. 10. The ground shook. Then, impact. Not the crushing blow of hooves, but a hard, solid force slamming into her side. An arm, thick and unyielding as an iron bar, hooked around her waist. She was yanked off her feet, the world spinning in a violent blur of sky and dirt. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs, but she did not hit the ground alone. A heavy weight landed beside her, rolling with her, shielding her. The wagon thundered past, inches from where they lay. The wind of its passing whipped her skirts. Dust washed over them in a suffocating wave. Evelyn lay in the dirt, gasping. She was tangled with someone. She could feel the rough texture of a canvas duster against her cheek. She could smell old leather, sweat, and horses. But beneath that, the scent of rain on dry earth. She looked up, her vision blurring. A man was hovering over her, his weight supported on his elbows so he wouldn't crush her. He was wearing a battered, wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. But she saw his eyes. They were dark, the color of coffee without cream, and they were scanning her face with an intensity that terrified her. Are you hurt? His voice was low, a rumble in his chest that she could feel against her own. Evelyn could not speak. Her mind was still fracturing, flickering between the present and the past. She looked at the wagon disappearing down the street, and for a heartbeat, she saw a small hand waving from the back of it. "The boy!" she choked out, clutching the stranger's shirt. "The fire!" The man did not look at the wagon. He looked at her. He did not pull away. His hands were firm on her shoulders, grounding her. "There is no fire." "Ma'am," he said. His voice was steady, slow. "Just a runaway team. You are safe. Look at me." Evelyn forced her eyes back to his. His face was weathered, tanned by years of sun. A thin, jagged scar ran from his jawline down into his collar, disappearing beneath his shirt. He did not look at her with the disgust she was used to. He looked concerned. The crowd began to gather around them, forming a circle of judgment. "Did you see that? It was the ward woman. Stood right in the way, trying to kill herself. Probably. Careful there. Ryder," a man shouted from the boardwalk. "She'll burn you too if you get too close. That one ain't right in the head." Another voice jeered. "Leave her be, Cowboy. She's cursed." Evelyn's shame hit her harder than the ground had. The haze of the flashback shattered, replaced by the acute, agonizing humiliation of the present. She realized she was lying in the dirt of the main street, held in the arms of a stranger, while the town watched and laughed. She scrambled backward, pushing against the man's chest. He let her go immediately, rocking back onto his heels but staying close, his hands held up slightly as if to catch her if she fell again. I, Evelyn stammered. She looked around for her flower. The sack had burst. White powder was scattered across the manure-stained street. Wasted. The stranger stood up. He was tall, towering over the crowd. He reached a hand down to her. Evelyn stared at the hand. It was large, calloused, the knuckles scarred. She did not take it. She pushed herself up, dusting off her skirts with shaking hands, keeping her eyes on the ground. "Thank you," she mumbled, her face burning. The cowboy did not lower his hand immediately. He turned his head, looking at the men on the boardwalk who had shouted. He didn't say a word. He just looked at them. His expression was dark, his jaw set in a hard line. The quiet menace in his posture silenced the jeers. He looked back at Evelyn. "You're shaking," he said quietly. "I'm fine." She lied. She turned to walk away, but her knees buckled. He was there again, his hand cupping her elbow. It was a light touch, respectful, but firm enough to hold her up. "You aren't fine," he said. "Come on, let's get you out of the street." "I have to go home," she whispered. "My flower." "I'll buy you more flour," he said. "Come on." He walked her toward the general store, not toward the crowd, but through them. He used his body as a shield, placing himself between her and the town. Evelyn was too weak to fight him. She let him guide her, focusing on the sound of his spurs chinking against the dirt. As they walked, he spoke. He didn't talk about the accident. He didn't ask why she had frozen. "Looks like a dry winter coming," he said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing crops over a fence. "Saw the creek is down 2 inches from yesterday. Hay prices are going to jump if we don't get rain by November. Probably go up to $12 a ton." Evelyn blinked, the mundane words cutting through the fog of her panic. He was talking about hay. He was anchoring her to the earth. They reached the shaded porch of the store. He guided her to a bench and sat her down. He stood a few feet away, leaning against a support post, giving her space. "Breathe," he said. "Just breathe." "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Caleb Ryder." He said, "Ryder." The name meant nothing to her, but the way the men on the street looked at him meant something. Just then, a man stepped out of the saloon next door. It was a heavy-set man with a star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Miller, though he did little law enforcement that didn't benefit the rich. Beside him was the ranch foreman for the Double Bar Ranch, a man named Silas. Silas squinted at Caleb. "Well, look at that. The drifter playing hero." Caleb tipped his hat, his face unreadable. "Just catching what falls." "Silas, I heard about you." "Ryder," Silas said, stepping closer. "I heard you rode with the McCrae gang down in Texas. Heard you left a man bleeding out in a dusty street in Abilene." Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. "You hear a lot of things. Silas, doesn't make them true, doesn't make them false." "Neither," Silas spat. "Mister, Pike don't like trouble on his payroll. You remember that. You're here to fix fences, not to socialize with the town witch." Evelyn flinched at the word. Caleb saw it. He pushed off the post, standing to his full height. "She's a lady. Silas, you do well to remember your manners. Silas laughed. A harsh, barking sound. A lady? That's Evelyn Ward. She's a cautionary tale. Ryder, you stick with her, and you'll find yourself burned. Just ask her husband. Oh, wait, you can't. He's Ash. Caleb took a step forward, his hand drifting dangerously close to his hip, though he wore no gun belt today. The violence radiating off him was sudden and cold. Walk away, Silas, Caleb said softly. Silas hesitated, sensing the danger, then spat on the ground and turned back to the saloon. Caleb let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing by a fraction. He turned back to Evelyn. The darkness in his eyes vanished, replaced by that same guarded concern. I'm sorry about that, he said. Evelyn stood up. She felt exposed, raw. She could not bear his kindness. It felt like a trap. It felt like something she would have to pay for later. I have to go, she said. She didn't wait for the flower. She didn't wait for him to speak again. She stepped off the porch and began to walk fast, heading out of town. Her empty hands clenched in fists. She walked the 5 miles home in a daze. She did not feel the heat. She did not feel the wind. When she finally reached her cabin, she rushed inside and slammed the door. She threw the bolt 1, 2, 3 times. She checked the window. She checked the stove. She slid down the wall until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She buried her face in her arms, but she didn't cry. Instead, she saw the image of the cowboy's face. She felt the phantom weight of his arm around her waist. She heard his voice, low and steady, talking about the price of hay while the world spun. He hadn't looked at her like she was crazy. He had looked at her like she was someone worth saving. The sun went down, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. Evelyn didn't light the lamp. She sat in the dark, listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. Eventually, exhaustion took her. She crawled into her bed, fully clothed. Sleep brought no peace. The nightmare came instantly. She was in the house. The fire was roaring. A living thing of orange and red. The heat was blistering. She was screaming, trying to reach the crib in the corner, but the floorboards were turning to quicksand, dragging her down. The smoke filled her lungs, choking her. She saw the face of her child, blurred and weeping. Then, the dream shifted. The wall of the burning house was torn away. Through the smoke and the flames, a figure stepped in. It was him. Caleb Ryder. He wasn't afraid of the fire. He walked through it as if it couldn't touch him. He reached out a hand, his palm scarred and open. Come on, he said in the dream. You are safe. Evelyn woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in the darkness. Her skin was clammy with cold sweat. Her heart was racing. She looked around the room, expecting to see flames, but saw only the pale moonlight filtering through the cracks in the roof. She lay back down, staring up at the rafters. The wind howled outside, lonely and fierce. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, the last thought in her mind before she drifted back to sleep was not of death, or fire, or guilt. I can't stop thinking about him, she whispered into the empty room. She thought of the cowboy who had held her like she wasn't broken, and for a terrifying moment, she wished he was there to hold her again. Summer did not relinquish its hold on the territory easily, but when it finally broke, it did so with a violence that startled even the oldest residents of Silver Creek. September bled into October, and the relentless, baking heat that had turned the ground to iron began to fracture under the weight of a new, sharper wind coming down from the high peaks. The air grew thin and brittle. The mornings, once suffocatingly warm before the sun even crested the horizon, were now edged with a frost that vanished the moment the light touched it, leaving the sagebrush wet and shivering. The land was a deceptive beauty. To a stranger passing through on a stagecoach, the valley might have looked like a painting of paradise, golden fields of wild rye waving in hypnotic ripples, the purple bruise of the mountains in the distance, a sky so clear it hurt to look at it. But to those who tried to scratch a living from the dirt, The beauty was a mask. The golden grass hid jagged rocks that could lame a horse in a heartbeat. The sky could turn from a vaulted cathedral of blue to a bruised, churning lid of storm clouds in the span of an hour. Caleb Ryder learned the lie of the land through the soles of his boots and the ache in his shoulders. He had been working at the Double Bar Ranch for 3 weeks. Mr. Harlan Pike was a man who believed that paying a wage gave him ownership of a man's soul, or at least the entirety of his waking hours. The work was brutal, unending, and exactly what Caleb needed. It was a physical punishment that kept his mind quiet. If his back screamed from digging post holes in the rocky soil, he did not have the energy to think about Texas. If his hands were raw from stretching barbed wire, he did not feel the phantom weight of a Colt revolver on his hip. He rode the fence line on a roan gelding that had a mouth as hard as the ground. The fence stretched for miles, a fragile assertion of ownership over a wilderness that did not care about deeds or titles. Caleb dismounted to check a leaning post. He grabbed the rough cedar, testing its give. It wobbled. "Rot," he muttered to the wind. He retrieved his tools from his saddlebags, a heavy hammer and a pouch of staples. He worked methodically, stripping off his leather gloves to feel the wire, ignoring the way the metal bit into his calloused skin. He drove the staples in with short, angry strokes. When he finished, he wiped the sweat from his forehead with his forearm and looked out across the valley. From this vantage point, high on a ridge, the world looked small. He could see the sprawl of the Double Bar headquarters to the north, a kingdom of whitewashed barns and corrals holding 500 head of cattle. And to the south, sitting alone like a mistake on the landscape, was the Ward homestead. It was pitifully small compared to Pike's empire. The house was a gray box of weathered timber that looked as if a strong gust might blow it over. The fence around the small garden plot was leaning dangerously, tired of fighting gravity. The field beyond it was patchy, the corn stalks stunted and brown, dying of thirst before they could ever truly grow. Caleb narrowed his eyes. He watched a small figure move from the house to the well. It was her, Evelyn, even from this distance. He could see the hesitation in her movements, the way she paused and looked around before committing to the simple act of drawing water. He felt a pull in his chest, a strange, heavy gravity that had nothing to do with the earth. He should not care. He was a drifter, a man with a price on his head if anyone bothered to look hard enough in the Texas ledgers. She was the town pariah, a woman haunted by ghosts he could not see. They were oil and water. But watching her struggle with the heavy bucket, he felt a sudden, irrational urge to ride down there and carry it for her. He spat on the ground, angry at himself. "You are here to work. Ryder," he told himself aloud, "not to save people who are already drowning." He mounted the roan and turned the horse's head away, forcing himself to focus on the next mile of broken wire. 2 days later, Evelyn stood in the shadow of the mercantile, her basket clutched tightly in both hands. The town of Silver Creek was busy with the mid-morning rush. Wagons clattered by, laden with supplies for the winter that everyone knew was coming early. Evelyn was trying to summon the courage to step out onto the boardwalk. She needed thread and salt, simple things that required a monumental effort to obtain. 2 women stood near the entrance of the shop, their backs to Evelyn. One was Mrs. Miller, the banker's wife, wearing a dress of fine blue wool that cost more than Evelyn's entire homestead. The other was a younger woman, holding a parasol to shield her face from the autumn sun. "I saw him at the smithy yesterday," Mrs. Miller was saying, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper that carried clearly in the crisp air. "The new hand at Pike's ranch. Ryder. He has a cold look about him." The younger woman agreed with a shudder. "My husband says there is talk he rode with the McCrae gang. They say he killed a marshal in Abilene over a card game. Just shot him dead without blinking." Mrs. Miller clicked her tongue. "Dangerous men always drift west. It is a wonder, mister. Pike hired him. A man like that is a ticking clock. Violence follows them like a smell. It is the eyes," the younger woman said. "He looks empty, like he has no soul left to lose. Evelyn pressed herself back against the rough wood of the building's exterior wall. Her heart gave a painful thud. Dangerous, killer, empty. The words wrapped around her throat. They were talking about Caleb, the man who had held her in the dirt while the horses thundered past, the man who had bought her flour and looked at her with worry. Not malice, but the words sounded so familiar. They were the same shape as the words people used for her. Crazy, wicked, cursed. She felt a sudden sickening kinship with the cowboy. He was a monster in their stories, just as she was a monster in theirs. Was he truly dangerous? Or was he just another person bleeding in a way the town refused to understand? She took a breath and stepped out, hoping to slip past them unnoticed. Mrs. Miller turned, her eyes narrowing as they landed on Evelyn. The conversation stopped instantly, replaced by a silence that was heavy with judgment. They pulled their skirts back, creating a wide berth, as if Evelyn's madness might rub off like soot. Evelyn kept her eyes on her boots. 1, 2, 3. Count the steps. She made it to the dry goods store and bought her thread, her hands shaking as she counted out the pennies. She left quickly, desperate to be back in the open air, away from the stifling weight of human eyes. As she passed the alleyway beside the Golden Nugget Saloon, the back door swung open. A swamper, a young boy hired to clean the floors, stumbled out carrying a crate of empty bottles and a rusted lantern. He tripped. The crate hit the ground with a shatter of glass. But it was the lantern that did it. It struck a discarded iron shoe scraper with a loud, metallic clang that rang out like a church bell dropped from a steeple. Evelyn stopped dead. The sound tore through her. It was not a lantern hitting iron. It was the sound of the fire bell ringing in the night. It was the sound of the shovel hitting the hard earth of a fresh grave. Her vision tunneled. The dusty street vanished. The smell of stale beer from the saloon was replaced by the acrid stench of burning pine. "No," she whimpered, her hands flying up to press against her ears. "Not again, not again." She crouched down right there in the street, squeezing her eyes shut, rocking slightly. "Hey, look at this." A group of 3 ranch hands had come around the corner. They were already drunk, despite the early hour, smelling of whiskey and boredom. One of them, a man with a gap-toothed grin named Davis, pointed at Evelyn. "The Widow Ward is having another spell," Davis shouted, laughing. "Did you hear that, boys? A little noise and she drops like a sack of potatoes. Watch out, Davis," his companion sneered. "She might set you on fire if you get too close. That is what crazy women do. They burn things to hide their sins." The laughter was jagged, cruel. It surrounded Evelyn, mixing with the ringing in her ears until she could not tell what was real and what was memory. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. It was not the shadow of a cloud. It was large, solid, and still. The laughter cut off abruptly, as if a knife had severed a rope. Evelyn opened her eyes. Through the blur of her panic, she saw a pair of worn, dust-covered boots standing between her and the men. She looked up, past denim trousers stiff with dirt, past a gun belt that held no pistol but looked like it belonged there, up to the broad shoulders of Caleb Ryder. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the men. His thumbs were hooked into his belt loops. He stood completely relaxed, yet the air around him crackled with a tension that made the hair on Evelyn's arms stand up. "That is enough," Caleb said. His voice was not loud. He did not shout. He spoke with a low, flat timbre that carried more weight than a scream. Davis blinked, his drunken bravado faltering. "We are just having a little fun. Ryder, she is crazy. Everyone knows it. She is a woman alone in the street," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming softer and infinitely more terrifying. "And you are 3 men mocking her. Now, I am not a man who likes trouble, Davis, but if you say one more word to her, I will take it as a personal insult, and I promise you, you will not find that funny." The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Caleb's shoulders were tight, the muscles in his jaw working. It was the stance of a man who was holding back a tidal wave of violence by sheer force of will. Davis looked at Caleb's eyes, saw whatever dark history lay buried there, and decided he wanted no part of it. He spat on the ground, trying to save face. "Come on, boys," Davis muttered. "Let's get another drink. She ain't worth the trouble." The men shuffled past, giving Caleb a wide berth. Caleb did not move until they were gone. Then, the tension drained from his frame, leaving him looking tired. He turned and crouched down, bringing himself to Evelyn's eye level. "Mrs. Ward?" he asked gently. Evelyn lowered her hands from her ears. She was trembling so hard her teeth clicked together. I heard—" "I know," Caleb said. "It was just a lantern and some fools with empty heads." He reached out a hand. She looked at it, the same scarred hand that had saved her before. This time, she did not hesitate. She placed her cold, shaking fingers into his warm palm. He pulled her up. She swayed, dizzy. The sky had changed while she was on the ground. Heavy, bruised clouds were rolling in from the west, blotting out the sun. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of ozone and rain. "Storm coming," Caleb said, looking at the sky. "You walking?" Evelyn nodded mutely. "I will walk with you," he said. "No," she protested weakly. "You have work, Mr. Pike. Mr. Pike can wait," Caleb said firmly. "I am not leaving you to walk 5 miles with a storm at your back and those men on the road." He did not give her a chance to argue. He guided her away from the town, onto the rutted dirt road that led to her homestead. They walked in silence for the first mile. The wind whipped at Evelyn's skirts and tore at the brim of Caleb's hat. The temperature was dropping fast. "Why do you do it?" Evelyn asked suddenly, her voice thin against the wind. "Do what? Stand up for me. You heard what they said. They say I'm crazy. They say I burned my husband. Why help a monster?" Caleb kept walking, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Because I know what it looks like when a person is drowning, Evelyn, and I know what it looks like when people stand on the shore and throw rocks instead of a rope." Evelyn hugged her shawl tighter. "It is not just gossip," she whispered. "Sometimes I lose time. I hear things, sounds, smells. They take me back. It is like I am not in my own body. I am broken, Caleb. The fire broke me and I never came back together, right?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the gravel. "We are all broken." "Evelyn," he said finally. His voice was rough. "I am not from a good family. I have never known a Sunday dinner that did not end in a fight. I have seen things, done things, that keep me awake at night." He glanced at her, his dark eyes unguarded for a brief second. "Some days, my own thoughts ride me like a spooked horse." He admitted, "I look at my hands and I do not see a ranch hand. I see the mistakes I made. I see the people I failed. If being broken makes you crazy, then I guess we are both ready for the asylum." Evelyn looked at him, stunned by his honesty. He wasn't trying to fix her. He was standing beside her in the wreckage. Suddenly, the wind changed. It stopped howling and started shrieking. Caleb stopped and looked west. A wall of brown earth was moving toward them, stretching from the ground to the clouds. "Dust storm!" he shouted over the rising gale. "It is moving fast. Within seconds, the sun was blotted out. The air turned gritty and yellow. Sand began to sting their faces like 1,000 tiny needles. "We have to move." Caleb grabbed her arm. "Keep your head down." They leaned into the wind, fighting for every step. The world dissolved into a brown haze. Evelyn could not see the road. She could not see the mountains. She could only feel Caleb's hand on her elbow, firm, guiding, anchoring her to the earth. He did not grab her painfully. He guided her by touch, his body blocking the worst of the wind. "We are close," she shouted, spitting grit from her mouth. "The barn is just ahead." They stumbled forward, blind and deafened by the roar of the wind. Finally, the dark outline of the barn loomed out of the dust. Caleb fumbled with the latch, shoved the heavy door open, and pushed Evelyn inside. He followed her in and heaved the door shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The silence was sudden and shocking. Outside, the wind screamed and battered the wood. But inside, the air was still. It smelled of sweet hay, old leather, and the warm, musky scent of the mule. Evelyn leaned back against the door, gasping for breath. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wild tangles around her face. Her face was streaked with dust. Caleb took off his hat and slapped it against his leg, sending a cloud of dust into the dim light. That came up quick, he said. Evelyn nodded, her heart still racing. The darkness of the barn was comforting, but also pressing. It was intimate. The mule snorted in the stall, shifting its weight. Evelyn shivered. It was not from the cold. It was from the adrenaline crashing out of her system. Caleb moved closer, his spur clinking softly on the dirt floor. He reached out and touched her shoulder, a tentative gesture. "You all right?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, but a sob escaped her throat before she could stop it. The fear of the town, the panic of the flashback, the terror of the storm. It all broke loose. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the ground, burying her face in her knees. Caleb hesitated only a moment. He sat down beside her in the dirt, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his side. "Talk to me," he said softly. "Tell me something real. How long have you had this place?" 3 years, she mumbled into her skirt. Since before." "And the boy?" Caleb asked. The question was a risk, a landmine, but he asked it with such gentleness that it didn't hurt. "What did he like?" Evelyn lifted her head. Tears were cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "He liked horses," she whispered. "He had a wooden horse. My husband carved it for him. He used to sleep with it. He called it Blue." She took a shuddering breath. His name was Thomas. He had a laugh that sounded like bubbles popping. She looked at Caleb. In the dim light, his face was all angles and shadows, but his eyes were steady. "The night of the fire," she said, the words spilling out like blood from a wound. "I was tired. I put him to bed. I sat down to mend a shirt. I must have knocked the lamp. Or maybe a spark. I do not know." She began to rock slightly. "I woke up and the wall was burning. I tried to get to him. I tried. Caleb. The smoke was so thick. I heard him crying. I got to the door, but the roof came down. The beam blocked the way. I couldn't move it. I pushed until my hands burned, but I couldn't move it." She held up her hands. They were trembling. "I stood outside and listened to it stop," she whispered. "And the town says I sat and watched. They say I wanted it." Caleb reached out. His large, rough hand covered hers completely. His palm was calloused, hard as stone, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "You are not alone in that fire." "Evelyn," he said fiercely, "not anymore. You are here. You are in this barn. You are with me." Evelyn looked at their joined hands. The contrast, her pale, shaking skin against his weathered, scarred toughness, was stark. She looked up at his face. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. She could smell the rain and sweat and tobacco on him. A sudden sharp bolt of desire shot through her, tangled inextricably with her fear. She wanted to lean into him. She wanted to bury her face in his chest and let him be the wall that held back the world. She wanted to know what his mouth felt like on hers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud enough that she was sure he could hear it. The air in the barn felt suddenly thin, charged with electricity. Caleb's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. Evelyn. The way he said her name, like a prayer and a warning, made her gasp. Panic flared. It was too much. She was too broken for this. She would ruin him. She would burn him just like the town said. She pulled her hand away abruptly. I should check the mule," she stammered, scrambling to her feet. "He gets scared in the wind." She hurried to the stall, putting the animal between them. She stroked the mule's velvet nose, her back to Caleb, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Caleb did not move for a long time. She could feel his eyes on her back. Finally, he stood up. The rustle of his duster sounded loud in the quiet barn. "Right," he said. His voice was rough, but composed. "Check the mule." They waited out the storm in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. When the wind finally died down to a manageable gust, Caleb opened the barn door. The world outside was brown and hazy, but the danger had passed. "I should get back," he said. "Silas will be looking for me." Evelyn nodded, still standing by the stall. "Thank you, Caleb, for walking me." Caleb paused at the door. He looked at the leaning fence, the rattling shutters of her house. "I'm going to check your perimeter before I go," he said. "Make sure the wind did not knock down any more fence. Don't want you chasing your mule halfway to Mexico tomorrow." He didn't wait for permission. He walked the property line, checking the posts, securing a loose shutter on her window with his pocket knife. It was a silent claiming. He was marking this territory as under his protection. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that terrified and thrilled Evelyn in equal measure. The autumn chilled rapidly. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned a brilliant, dying yellow. And every evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, turning the sky to a bruised purple, a rider would appear on the road. Caleb found excuses. They were thin excuses, transparent as glass, but neither of them acknowledged it. One day, he brought a handful of heavy iron hinges he claimed were scrap from the ranch. "Found these lying around," he said, dismounting. "Your garden gate is hanging by a thread. Might as well fix it." He spent an hour fixing the gate. His shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the corded muscles of his forearms. Evelyn brought him a cup of water, their fingers brushing as he took the tin cup. The contact sent a jolt through her that lingered long after he let go. Another day, he brought a sack of oats for her mule. Overordered at the ranch, he lied smoothly. Pike would just let it rot. He chopped wood for her without being asked. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the axe became a sound Evelyn waited for. It was the sound of safety. They talked. At first, it was small talk, the weather, the cattle, the price of dry goods. But slowly, the spaces between the words filled with meaning. She learned that he liked his coffee black and bitter. She learned that he hated the wind because it reminded him of the open plains of Texas where there was nowhere to hide. He learned that she hummed when she was nervous. He learned that she checked the door latch 3 times because she believed it kept the bad luck out. He didn't laugh. He just waited until she had checked it the 3rd time before saying goodbye. One evening, he was tightening the cinch on his saddle, preparing to leave. The sun was gone, leaving the world in a wash of gray twilight. The wind was tugging at Evelyn's skirts and whipping strands of hair across her face. Caleb turned to her. He reached out and, with a hesitation that broke her heart, tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek for a second, rough skin against soft. "Be safe." "Evelyn," he said. "You too." "Caleb." He mounted his horse and rode away, dissolving into the gathering dark. Evelyn stood at her door, watching him go until he was nothing but a speck of shadow. She touched her cheek where his fingers had been. Her skin felt hot. She turned to the empty, silent house. The fear was still there, the fear of the fire, the fear of the town, the fear of her own mind. But there was something else now, something stronger. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the doorframe. "I can't stop thinking about his hands," she whispered to the wind. She thought of his steady voice that cut through her panic. She thought of the quiet way he looked at her, not as a tragedy to be pitied, and not as a monster to be feared. He looked at her like she was just a woman he wanted to know. And for the first time in years, the thought of tomorrow did not fill her with dread. It filled her with a terrifying, beautiful hope. The transition from autumn to winter was not a slide but a cliff edge. One week, the cottonwoods still held a few stubborn, golden leaves. The next, a norther blew in, stripping the branches bare and leaving them looking like black fractures against a slate-gray sky. The frost came hard and fast, killing the last of Evelyn Ward's meager garden overnight. The few pumpkins she had hoped to harvest collapsed into rotted, orange mush, and the ground froze solid, ringing like iron under the strike of a hoof. The world contracted, the horizon, usually so vast, disappeared behind curtains of falling snow and low-hanging clouds. The days grew short, the sunlight weak and watery, offering no real warmth. For a woman living alone, winter was not just a season. It was a siege. Caleb Ryder felt the cold in his old injuries, the ache in his shoulder where a horse had thrown him years ago, the stiffening of the knuckles in his right hand. But his concern was not for himself. From the ridge where he worked the double-bar cattle, he watched the chimney of the Ward homestead. The smoke that rose from it was thin, wispy. He knew what that meant. She was rationing wood. He rode into the main yard of the double bar just as the sun began to bleed out behind the mountains. Harlan Pike was standing by the corral, inspecting a new breeding bull. Pike was a man of heavy appetites and heavy hands, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that made him look like a bear walking on two legs. "Mr. Pike," Caleb said, dismounting. Pike didn't look away from the bull. "Work is done. Ryder, you looking for supper?" "I'm looking to take a wagon," Caleb said. "There's a pile of seasoned oak in the north pasture, the blowdowns from the storm last year. It is just rotting there." Pike turned slowly, chewing on the end of a cigar. "And what do you want with old wood?" "Bunkhouse stove is plenty hot." "It isn't for the bunkhouse," Caleb said, keeping his voice even. "It is for the Ward place. The widow is low on fuel. If this freeze holds, she won't make it to Christmas." Pike's eyes narrowed, almost disappearing into the folds of his fleshy face. "The widow? You have been spending a lot of time down that road. Ryder, some of the boys are talking." "Let them talk," Caleb said. "It is just wood. Mr. Pike, it costs you nothing. Makes the double bar look generous to the town. Good for your reputation." Pike laughed, a wet, wheezing sound. "You think I care about my reputation with the likes of this town? I own this town." He stepped closer to Caleb, the smell of expensive tobacco and stale whiskey coming with him. "But you are right about one thing," Pike said. "Generosity buys loyalty. I will let you take the wood. You can play hero to the crazy woman." "Thank you," Caleb said, turning to go. "Hold on," Pike said. His voice lost its amusement. Caleb stopped. "I help you, Ryder, and you help me," Pike said. "That is how the world works." "I had a letter from a friend in Texas yesterday. A Texas Ranger. He is looking for a man who fits your description. Something about a shooting in Abilene, a dead brother, a missing stash of payroll money." Caleb went very still. The wind whistled through the corral fence, cold and sharp. "I don't know anything about payroll money," Caleb said quietly. Pike smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "I didn't say you did. I just said he is looking. Be a shame if I had to write him back and tell him where to look. But as long as my ranch runs smooth, and my men do what I tell them, I'm a terrible correspondent. I forget to write letters all the time." The threat hung in the freezing air, heavy as a stone. "You understand me, Ryder?" Pike asked. "I understand," Caleb said. "Good. Go take the wood to your lady friend. But remember, men who court madness usually end up dragged down by it, and I won't pull you out if you fall." The following Sunday, the church bell tolled across the frozen valley, a mournful sound that seemed to crack the brittle air. Evelyn did not want to go. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to bolt the door and hide under her quilt. But she knew that if she stopped attending, the whispers would turn into shouts. Absence was an admission of guilt in Silver Creek. She sat in the back pew, as always, her head bowed, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The church was cold, despite the potbelly stove in the corner. Reverend Clay stood at the pulpit. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to see sin in the dust motes dancing in the light. He did not look at Evelyn, which was worse than if he had. He looked over the heads of the congregation, his voice booming. "The mind is the fortress of the soul," Clay shouted, slamming a hand on the Bible. "And when the walls of that fortress crumble, we must ask ourselves, why? Is it an accident? Or is it the rot of sin eating away the foundation?" The congregation was silent. Evelyn felt the eyes of the women in the pew ahead of her. She could feel their judgment like heat on her skin. We see it in our own community, Clay continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. We see those who are afflicted with madness, those who hear voices, those who are haunted by the fires of their own making. We tell ourselves it is a tragedy, but the Lord tells us that a disordered mind is the fruit of a disordered spirit. A woman who cannot control her mind is a vessel for chaos. Evelyn stared at her boots. A tear slipped from her eye and landed on her dark skirt, leaving a tiny, wet circle. She did it. The silence whispered, "She is wicked. She is being punished." Caleb stood by the heavy oak doors at the back of the church. He never sat. He stood like a guard dog, hat in his hands, his back to the wall. He watched the back of Evelyn's head. He saw the way her shoulders shook with suppressed tremors. He looked at Reverend Clay, and for a moment, he imagined walking down the aisle and dragging the man from the pulpit. The violence in the thought surprised him. He wanted to shatter the man's jaw. He wanted to burn the church down. Instead, he crushed the brim of his hat in his hands. He could not save her from this. If he intervened, it would only prove their point, that she was a temptress who led men to violence. He had to watch her break, piece by piece, and do nothing. 2 nights later, the air was so cold it burned the lungs. Evelyn was inside her cabin, trying to mend a tear in her heavy wool coat. Her fingers were clumsy with the cold. The fire in her stove was low. She was trying to make the wood Caleb had brought last. Outside, the wind shifted. A smell drifted through the cracks in the walls. It was not the clean smell of oak burning in her stove. It was acrid, dirty, the smell of pine needles and wet brush smoldering. Evelyn's head snapped up. Her heart gave a single, massive thump. She went to the window. Through the frosted glass, she saw a glow. It was orange and flickering, reflecting off the snow in the yard. Panic, cold and instantaneous, washed over her. "It is happening again," a voice screamed in her head. She did not put on her coat. She did not think. She threw open the door and ran out into the snow. The glow was coming from the neighboring property. 100 yards away, a ranch hand was burning a pile of cleared brush, trying to get rid of it before the heavy snows buried it. The flames leaped high, whipped by the wind, sending sparks dancing into the black sky. To anyone else, it was a bonfire. To Evelyn, it was her house. The years stripped away. She was 23 again. She was standing in her nightdress. The heat was blistering. "Thomas!" she screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and terrified. She ran toward the fence, her boots slipping on the ice. She fell, scraping her hands on the frozen dirt. But she scrambled up again. The fire was roaring. She could hear the crackle of the timber. She could hear the roof groaning. And under the roar, she heard it, the high, thin wail of a child. "Mama, help me! I am coming!" she shrieked. "I am coming! Baby!" She reached the fence and grabbed the rough wood, shaking it. The fire was right there. She could feel the heat on her face. She had to get in. She had to get him out. "Why won't the door open?" she sobbed, clawing at the fence post. "Open the door." She sank to her knees in the snow, her mind completely shattered. She was no longer in the snow. She was in the hallway of her burning home, blocked by a fallen beam, the smoke filling her lungs, the sound of her son dying just feet away. "I am sorry," she screamed, rocking back and forth, her hands tearing at her own hair. "I am sorry. I am sorry. I tried. I tried." Caleb was riding the road back from the double bar. He saw the fire from a half-mile away and knew instantly what it would do to her. He spurred his horse, the animal grunting as it galloped over the frozen ground. He vaulted from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He ran to where she was crouched in the snow. She looked small, broken, a dark shape against the white ground. She was screaming at the empty air, her voice ragged. "Evelyn!" He reached her and dropped to his knees. He grabbed her shoulders. She was shaking so violently it felt like she was vibrating apart. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the bonfire, but she wasn't seeing it. Her pupils were blown wide with terror. "The door is stuck," she wailed, thrashing against his grip. "He is in there! Caleb, he is in there!" Caleb didn't argue with her hallucination. He didn't tell her it wasn't real. He knew that to her. It was the only reality that existed. Instead, he pulled her to him, wrapping his arms around her, crushing her against the rough wool of his coat. He buried one hand in her hair and used the other to press her face into his chest, blocking her view of the fire. "Evelyn, listen to me." His voice was a command, deep and rumbling against her ear. "Feel the cold." He took her bare hand and pressed it against a patch of snow on the ground. "Feel that? It is ice. It is snow. Fire is hot. Evelyn, this is cold." She gasped, the shock of the freezing snow cutting through the panic. "Smell the air," he said, holding her tight. "It smells like winter. It smells like snow." He moved one hand to her cheek, his palm rough and calloused. "Feel my hand," he said. "This is Caleb. I am here. There is no fire here. Just us. Just the cold." Evelyn's thrashing slowed. The sensory details began to anchor her. The bite of the cold on her skin. The smell of wet wool and tobacco from his coat. The solid, unmoving strength of his chest. She blinked, and the burning house flickered and vanished, replaced by a bonfire in a field and the dark, terrified night. She collapsed against him, all the strength leaving her body at once. A sob ripped through her, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. "It was my fault," she sobbed into his coat. "No," Caleb whispered, stroking her hair. "No, it was—" She insisted, her voice muffled. "I did it. I knocked the lamp. I was so tired." "Caleb." Thomas had been sick. I hadn't slept in 2 days. I poured a glass of whiskey to help me sleep. Just one glass. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes begging for judgment. "The town is right," she whispered. "I was drunk. I knocked the lamp. And when the fire started, I froze. Just like today. I stood there and I let them die. I didn't try hard enough. I didn't burn my hands enough. I lived. Caleb. I lived and they burned." The confession hung between them, the poison she had been carrying for 3 years. She waited for him to push her away. She waited for the look of disgust. Caleb looked down at her. His face was unreadable in the shadows, but his arms didn't loosen. "You think you are the only one carrying a ghost?" he asked softly. He shifted, sitting back in the snow and pulling her with him so she wasn't kneeling in the slush. "My brother," he said. His name was Seth. He was 18. Caleb looked at the distant bonfire, his jaw tightening. "We were in a saloon in Fort Worth. I was drunk, mean drunk. A man bumped my arm, spilled my drink. I pushed him. He pushed back. I went for my gun. I was fast back then. Too fast." He looked back at Evelyn. "Seth saw the other man draw. He stepped in front of me. He didn't even have a gun. He just wanted to stop the fight. The bullet meant for me took him in the chest." Caleb's voice cracked. "Just a fracture in the stone. He died on the sawdust floor while I held him. My gun was in my hand. I started the fight. I drew first. I killed him as sure as if I pulled the trigger myself." Evelyn stared at him. She saw the scar on his soul that matched the one on his face. "I ran," Caleb said. "I have been running for 6 years, trying to find a place where I don't see his face when I close my eyes." He wiped a thumb across her cheek, clearing away a smudge of ash. "We are both walking through the fire. Evelyn, but you are not wicked. You are just hurt." They sat there for a long time, 2 broken people huddled together in the snow, the warmth of their bodies the only thing keeping the winter at bay. "Come on," Caleb said eventually. "You will freeze to death out here." He helped her up and walked her back to the porch. They didn't go inside yet. They sat on the top step, the overhang shielding them from the wind. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, trembling vulnerability. They sat close, their shoulders pressing together, their breath plumed in the air, mingling in a single cloud. "What do you dream about?" Evelyn asked quietly. "When you don't dream about him." Caleb looked at his boots. "I dream about a piece of land, not big, just enough for a few horses. A place where the wind doesn't blow so hard. A place where I can put my gun in a drawer and leave it there." He turned to her. What about you? I dream of silence, she said. Not the lonely kind. The peaceful kind. The kind where I don't have to check the door 3 times. She looked at his chest, at the steady rise and fall of his breath. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his heart. She could feel the heavy, rhythmic thrum of it through his coat. It was a strong heart, a survivor's heart. Caleb went still. He looked at her hand, then covered it with his own, his fingers interlaced with hers, locking them together. He looked up, and their eyes met. The distance between them vanished. The months of stolen glances, of brushed hands, of shared pain, it all compressed into this single moment. The longing was a physical ache in Evelyn's chest, sharper than the cold. Caleb leaned in slowly. He gave her every chance to pull away. He gave her 1,000 moments to say no. She didn't pull away. She leaned forward. Their lips met. It was cold lips on cold lips. Tentative at first. A question asked in the dark. Is this allowed? Are we allowed? Then, Caleb made a low sound in his throat, and the kiss deepened. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. It was the taste of hunger and relief. Evelyn's hands came up to grip the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer. Caleb's hand cupped the back of her neck, his fingers tangled in her loose hair, holding her like she was the only solid thing in the world. For a moment, Evelyn forgot the fire. She forgot the town. She felt alive. She felt a rush of heat that had nothing to do with destruction and everything to do with creation. But then, the fear spiked. If she wanted this, if she took this happiness, surely the other shoe would drop. Surely God would punish her again. She gasped, pulling back slightly, her eyes wide. Caleb sensed the shift instantly. He didn't let go, but he stopped the kiss. He rested his forehead against hers, their noses touching, their breath mixing. "I am scared," she whispered. "I know," he rasped. His voice was hoarse. "Me too. I will ruin you. Caleb, Pike, the town. They will destroy you for being with me. Let them try," he said. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "I am not going to take anything you don't want to give, Evelyn, but I am done running, and I am done watching you freeze." The days that followed were a secret war against the winter. The snows came in earnest, burying the valley in 3 feet of white powder. Travel became difficult, but Caleb still came. He rode a plow horse now, a beast with feet like dinner plates that could trudge through the drifts. Their interactions changed. The barrier of propriety had been burned away by the confession in the snow. When he brought wood in, he lingered. He would warm his hands at her stove, and she would stand beside him, close enough that their arms brushed. He would reach out and tuck a stray hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on the sensitive skin of her neck. They stole moments. In the barn, checking the mule's hooves, he would stand behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his chin resting briefly on the top of her head. In town, when they passed each other on the street, the look they shared was a conversation without words, a promise of heat in a frozen world. But the town was watching, in the warm, mahogany-paneled office of the double-bar ranch house. Harlan Pike poured a drink for Reverend Clay. "The sheriff says Ryder was at her place again last night," Pike said, swilling the amber liquid. "Left his horse tied out front till midnight." Reverend Clay shook his head, his face a mask of pious sorrow. "It is as I feared. The woman is a succubus. She draws men in with her madness. She will drag him down to hell with her." "It is a liability," Pike said flatly. "Ryder is a good hand. Best I've seen with a rope. But if he gets tangled up with the ward woman, he gets unpredictable. And now that I know he is wanted in Texas, well, a man with nothing to lose is a dangerous thing. We must protect the community," Clay said. "And we must protect Evelyn from herself. She is clearly unable to care for herself. The outbursts, the delusions. There is a sanitarium in Carson City," Pike said, watching the Reverend carefully. "A state facility. For the indigent and insane. It would be a mercy." Clay agreed. "A place where she can be managed." "And with her gone," Pike added, taking a sip. That land of hers goes up for auction. It sits right on the creek. Good water rights. Clay paused, then nodded slowly. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Harlan, the storm hit on a Tuesday. It was a true blizzard, a whiteout that erased the world. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the shutters of Evelyn's cabin until she thought the glass would shatter. Caleb had beaten the worst of it, riding in just as the sky turned black. He had brought a sack of grain and a heavy quilt he had stolen from the bunkhouse. "You can't ride back in this," Evelyn said, looking out the window at the wall of white. "You will die before you make the main road." "Then I guess I'm staying," Caleb said. He barred the door. He hung the quilt over the drafty window. The cabin was small, dimly lit by the single oil lamp and the glow of the stove. The storm outside made the inside feel like a capsule, a world entirely their own. They ate a meager supper of beans and cornbread. Sitting on the floor by the stove, the tension in the room was palpable. It was a physical weight, heavier than the snow on the roof. Caleb finished eating and set his plate aside. He looked at Evelyn. The firelight cast dancing shadows on her face. She looked beautiful and terrified. He reached out and took her hand. "Come here," he said softly. Evelyn moved. She didn't think. She just moved. She crawled the few feet across the rug and settled between his spread legs, her back to his chest. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight. He rested his chin on her shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind scream. Then, Caleb turned his head and kissed the sensitive spot just below her ear. Evelyn gasped, her head falling back against his shoulder. His hands moved. They weren't checking for injuries now. They were exploring. One hand moved flat against her stomach, the thumb tracing the line of her ribs, the other tangled in her hair. Evelyn turned in his arms, straddling his lap, facing him. The kiss was urgent, frantic. It was a reaction to the storm, a defiance of the death that waited outside. Their mouths moved together, hot and wet. Evelyn's hands gripped his shoulders, feeling the hard muscle beneath the shirt. Caleb's hand slid down to her waist, pulling her hips against his. She could feel the desire radiating off him, a tightly coiled spring. But she could also feel his restraint. He was shaking with the effort of holding back. "Caleb," she breathed, pulling away to gasp for air. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her skin, soap and flour and woman. "I want you," he groaned against her skin. "God, Evelyn, I want you so much it hurts. I want you too," she whispered. But as his hand moved up her spine, grazing the buttons of her dress, the fear spiked again. A flash of the fire, a flash of the preacher's face. Wicked. Punishment. She stiffened. Caleb stopped instantly. He didn't pull away, but his hands went still. He lifted his head, his eyes dark and blown wide. Searching her face, he saw the fear battling the desire. "It is okay," he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers. "It is okay. We don't have to. I want to," she said, tears pricking her eyes. I am afraid. If I let go, I don't know if I can come back." "Then we just hold on," Caleb said. He shifted her so she was lying beside him on the rug, wrapping the stolen quilt around them both. He pulled her against him, her back to his front, spooning her. His arm went over her waist, his hand lacing with hers over her heart. They lay there in the dark, the fire dying down to embers. The desire was still there, a hot, throbbing ache between them. But the intimacy of simply holding each other was sharper. Outside, the snow piled up against the door, sealing them in. Inside, their breathing slowly synchronized. Caleb pressed a kiss to the back of her head. "Sleep, Evelyn. I am here. I am not going anywhere." For the first time in her life, Evelyn believed him. But as she drifted off, the wind outside sounded like a warning. The storm was here, but the real danger was coming from the town, and no amount of snow could stop it. The winter did not merely arrive in the valley. It settled in like a siege army, determined to starve out anything that possessed the audacity to be alive. By January, the snow was no longer a weather event but a geological feature, piled in drifts as high as a horse's wither against the windward side of the barns. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture in a man's nose froze with every inhale, and the cottonwood trees along the creek popped and cracked like rifle shots as their sap expanded and split the wood. Survival was a quiet, daily battle. It was the breaking of ice on the water trough every 3 hours. It was the careful counting of logs in the wood pile. It was the way boots crunched on the hard-packed crust of the snow, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the frozen world. For Evelyn Ward, the cold was the least of her enemies. The isolation she had once cultivated as a shield had turned into a prison. The road to town was treacherous, leaving her trapped in the small cabin with the wind shrieking through the chinking. But the town did not leave her alone. Reverend Clay came on a Tuesday, riding a tall black gelding that looked as severe as he did. He did not remove his hat when he entered Evelyn's cabin, a subtle slight that made the space feel smaller. He stood by the stove, warming his gloved hands, looking around the single room with a critical eye. Evelyn stood by the table, her hands covered in flour from the biscuits she had been trying to make. She felt like a child called before the schoolmaster. "It is a hard winter. Evelyn," the Reverend said. His voice was smooth, polished like a river stone, but cold to the touch. "Yes, Reverend," she whispered. "I worry about you out here," he continued, turning his pale eyes on her. "A woman alone, a woman with burdens. I have been praying on it. Evelyn, I have been speaking with the Lord about your soul." Evelyn said nothing. She wiped her hands on her apron, creating a cloud of white dust. "The Lord tells me that you are suffering," Clay said, taking a step closer. "He tells me that your mind is a storm that cannot be quieted here. There are places, Evelyn, places in the city, sanatoriums where good, Christian doctors can help women like you." The word sanatorium hung in the air like the blade of a guillotine. "I do not want to go away," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "This is my home." "Is it a home?" Clay asked, sweeping his hand toward the window where the snow pressed against the glass. "Or is it a tomb you have built for yourself? The town is frightened. Evelyn, they see your fits. They hear you screaming at ghosts. It is not safe, for you or for us." He placed a hand on her shoulder. The leather of his glove was cold through her dress. "Think on it," he said. "It is God's will that you find peace, and peace is not here. When he left..." Evelyn bolted the door. She checked it 3 times, then 4, then 5. She backed into the corner of the room and slid down the wall, wrapping her arms around her knees. The walls of the cabin felt like they were inching closer, compressing the air until she could barely breathe. The pressure was not only on Evelyn. At the Double Bar Ranch, the bunkhouse was a place of simmering resentment. The men were bored, cold, and looking for someone to blame for their misery. Caleb Ryder kept to himself, mending tack in the corner, but he could feel the eyes on him. Harlan Pike called Caleb to the main house the day after the Reverend's visit. The office smelled of expensive cigars and the coal fire burning in the grate. Pike sat behind his massive oak desk, a king on a throne of cattle and land. "Sit down, Ryder," Pike said. Caleb remained standing, his hat in his hand. "I will stand. Mr. Pike," Pike chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Suit yourself. You are a stubborn man. I like that. But stubbornness can be expensive." Pike leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. "I have a problem, Ryder. There is a small rancher on the North Creek, Miller. He is grazing his cattle on land that belongs to the Double Bar by right of water. The sheriff is too soft to move him. I need someone to go down there and explain the situation to Miller. Maybe knock down a few fences. Maybe help his cows find their way elsewhere." "You want me to strong-arm a homesteader," Caleb said flatly. "I want you to protect my interests." Pike corrected. "You are a big man. Ryder, people get out of your way. I need an enforcer. I was hired to work cattle." Caleb said, "I trade my sweat, Mr. Pike. not my conscience. Pike's face hardened. His eyes became slits in the doughy flesh of his face. Conscience is a luxury for men with clean pasts, he said softly. And yours is dirty as a pigsty, isn't it? Caleb's grip on his hat tightened. I know about the woman, Pike said, leaning back. The widow ward. The Reverend wants to ship her off to Carson City. Says she is a danger. The town agrees. They are drawing up the papers to have her committed. Caleb felt a cold knot form in his stomach. However, Pike continued, inspecting the ash of his cigar, if I were to speak for her, if I were to say she is harmless, the town would listen. I could keep her out of that asylum. Ryder, but I only do favors for men who do favors for me. It was a trap. A clean, brutal trap. Pike was offering Evelyn's freedom in exchange for Caleb's soul. Caleb looked at the man, wealthy, powerful, and utterly rotten. He thought of Evelyn's terrified eyes. He thought of the way she checked the door latch. I won't do it, Caleb said. Pike froze. Excuse me? I won't hurt a man just because you want his water, Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. And if you touch her, Pike, if you let them take her. Are you threatening me? Pike roared, slamming his hand on the desk. You are a drifter, a nobody. I can crush you like a bug. You can try, Caleb said. He turned and walked out of the office, the heavy door slamming behind him. He walked out into the snow, his heart hammering. He had refused the devil, but he knew the devil would not take the insult lightly. Retaliation came 2 nights later. The alarm was raised at midnight, a glow on the horizon. A shout from the night watchman, "Fire!" Caleb ran out of the bunkhouse, pulling his coat over his long underwear. To the east, near the edge of Pike's property, a hay shed was burning. The flames licked at the sky, casting a bloody light on the snow. By the time the men got there with buckets, the structure was a loss. It collapsed into a pile of hissing embers. The sheriff was there by morning, standing in the smoking ruin with Pike and Reverend Clay. Caleb stood with the other hands, watching. We found tracks, the sheriff said, pointing to a set of footprints leading toward the creek. Small boots. A woman's boots. Someone saw her, Pike said loudly. Making sure the ranch hands heard, one of the boys saw Evelyn Ward wandering out this way near sundown, looking lost, muttering to herself. It is the madness. Reverend Clay sighed. She is drawn to the fire. She cannot help herself. She burned her own child, and now she is burning our winter feed. The lie was so blatant, so constructed, that Caleb felt the blood roar in his ears. They were framing her. They were using her trauma to paint her as a monster. She wasn't here, Caleb said. The heads turned. The sheriff looked at him with narrow eyes. What did you say? Ryder? The sheriff asked. I said she wasn't here, Caleb repeated, stepping forward. The silence of the other men was heavy. And how would you know that? Pike sneered. Were you babysitting? She was with me, Caleb said. The words dropped into the cold air like stones. She was with you, the sheriff asked, a smirk touching his lips. All night? All night. Caleb lied. I was at her cabin. I didn't leave until dawn. She never left the house. A murmur went through the ranch hands. To admit to spending the night with a widow, an unmarried woman, was to admit to a scandal that would ruin her reputation as thoroughly as the arson accusation. But it was the only shield he had. So, Pike said, his voice dripping with venom, you are admitting to compromising the lady's virtue to save her from a jail cell. I am telling you, she didn't burn your shed, Caleb said, his eyes locking with Pike's. And anyone who says otherwise is a liar. The sheriff spat tobacco juice into the snow. Well, that makes things complicated. But we will see. I sent a telegram to Texas yesterday. Ryder. Asked about a man matching your description involved in a shooting in Abilene. Expect I will have an answer in a day or two. Then we will see who is a liar. Caleb stood his ground, but he felt the walls closing in. He had bought Evelyn time, but he had painted a target on his own back. The tension broke 3 nights later, on a Saturday. Harlan Pike had given the ranch hands extra whiskey. He had spoken loudly in the bunkhouse about how the town wasn't safe with a fire starter loose, and how the law was too slow to act. He had wound the men up like clockwork toys and set them loose. Caleb was in the tack room when he heard them. "Just going to scare her," one voice laughed. "Ride around the house, make some noise, shake the crazy out of her. Maybe break a few windows. Let the cold in." Caleb dropped the bridle he was cleaning. He didn't stop to saddle his horse. He ran to the corral, grabbed a handful of mane, and vaulted onto the bare back of the big bay gelding. He kicked the horse into a gallop, tearing out of the yard, the snow flying from the hooves. At the homestead, Evelyn was asleep. She woke to the sound of thunder, but it wasn't the sky. It was the sound of hooves circling her house. Shouts pierced the walls. "Come out, witch! Burn any barns lately? Widow, fire! Fire! Fire!" The men were drunk, riding in a circle around the cabin, hooting and hollering. Then a rock struck the window. The glass shattered, spraying across the floor. The sound of the breaking glass was the trigger. Evelyn was instantly transported. The cold wind rushing through the broken pane became the draft of a fire sucking in oxygen. The shouts of the men became the screams of her dying husband. She scrambled out of bed, her nightgown thin against the freezing air. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know when she was. She ran to the kitchen table. Her hand closed around the handle of the bread knife. "They are coming," she whispered, her eyes wide and vacant. "They are coming to finish it." Another rock hit the door. Thud, thud. She backed into the corner, holding the knife out, her hand shaking so hard the blade blurred. She was hyperventilating, the sound of her own gasping breath loud in her ears. Then, the rhythm of the hooves outside changed. A new horse arrived, galloping hard. There was a shout, louder than the rest. "Get back!" It was Caleb. He slid the bay horse to a halt between the circling riders and the front porch. He jumped from the horse's back, landing in the snow with a heavy crunch. He stood on the porch steps, facing the 5 riders. They were men he worked with, men he had shared coffee with. Now, in the moonlight, their faces were twisted with drink and mob cruelty. "Go home!" Caleb roared. "Whoa, now!" "Rider!" one of the men shouted, swaying in his saddle. "We are just having some fun, just giving the widow a serenade." "You are terrorizing a woman," Caleb said, his voice shaking with rage. "Turn those horses around, now! Make us!" Another man jeered. "You are just one man, Tex, and a wanted one at that." The man reached for the coiled rope on his saddle horn. It was a threatening gesture, a hint of a lynching. Caleb didn't think. The reflex burned into him from a lifetime of hard living took over. His hand moved. It was a blur of motion. The heavy Colt revolver was out of his waistband and leveled at the rider's chest before the man had even touched his rope. The hammer clicked back with a sound that cut through the drunken laughter like a knife. "I will put you in the ground," Caleb said. The darkness in him, the violence he had been running from for 6 years, rose up and swallowed him. He wanted to pull the trigger. He wanted to kill them for touching her house. He was half a second away from becoming a murderer again. "Caleb." The voice was thin, broken, coming from behind him. Caleb froze. His finger hovered on the trigger. He didn't turn, but his focus shifted. "Caleb, please." It was Evelyn. She was standing in the doorway, the knife hanging loosely in her hand, the broken glass crunching under her bare feet. She wasn't looking at the men. She was looking at him. "Don't," she whispered. The sound of her voice pierced the red haze of his rage. He blinked. He saw the man in front of him, young, stupid, drunk, with terror now dawning in his eyes. Caleb took a breath. It shuddered in his chest. He didn't lower the gun, but he didn't fire. "Get out of here," he rasped, "before I change my mind." The men, sobered by the sight of the gun and the pure, lethal intent in Caleb's eyes, turned their horses. They grumbled, but they rode off, disappearing into the dark and the snow. Caleb stood there for a long moment, the gun still raised, aiming at the empty night. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his arm He decocked the hammer. He turned around. Evelyn dropped the knife. It clattered on the floorboards. Her legs gave out. Caleb was there before she hit the ground. He caught her, scooping her up into his arms. She was freezing, her skin like ice, her body convulsing with tremors. He kicked the door shut behind him and carried her to the bed. He grabbed the quilts, piling them over her, but she couldn't stop shaking. "I heard them," she stammered, her teeth chattering violently. "I heard the fire. I heard the glass. I thought... Shh, Caleb murmured, climbing onto the bed with her, boots and all. He pulled her against him, wrapping his heavy coat around her, trying to transfer his heat into her. I know, they are gone." He held her tightly, one hand pressing her head to his chest so she could hear his heart. It was beating fast, stuttering with the adrenaline of the near killing. "I almost did it," he whispered into her hair. "I almost killed him. Evelyn." "You didn't," she said, clutching his shirt with desperate hands. "You stopped." "Only because of you." The fear in the room began to shift. The adrenaline that had nearly led to death now twisted into something else, a desperate need to affirm life. Evelyn lifted her head. Her face was inches from his. In the dark, her eyes were huge, searching. "I am cold," she whispered. "Caleb, I am so cold." He didn't need to ask. He stripped off his heavy coat. He pulled off his boots. He gathered her back into his arms, skin seeking skin, warmth seeking warmth. They kissed, and it was not gentle. It was a collision. It was the desperate hunger of two people who had stood on the edge of a cliff and looked down. Evelyn kissed him like she was trying to breathe him in, trying to replace the memory of the smoke with the taste of him. Caleb kissed her with a ferocity that bordered on pain, trying to anchor himself, to prove that he was a man who could love, not just a man who could kill. His hands moved over her, rough and urgent, memorizing the curve of her spine, the sharpness of her hip. Her hands were in his hair, pulling him closer, closer, until there was no space left between them. They didn't speak. There were no words for this. They tangled together under the quilts, a knot of limbs and heat. It was raw and frantic and deeply, achingly human. It was a defiance of the winter, of the town, of the death that stalked them both. Later, in the quiet dark, the storm outside seemed miles away. They lay side by side, their fingers interlaced. The room was freezing, but under the heavy blankets, they were warm. Evelyn traced the line of the scar on his shoulder with her fingertip. "I never thought I would want this again," she whispered. "I thought that part of me burned up. I thought no one would ever want to touch the scars." Caleb turned his head to look at her. "I am terrified," he admitted, his voice rough. "Of what?" "Of how much I want to stay. Being here with you, it makes me imagine a life I don't deserve. A man like me doesn't get a home. Evelyn, he doesn't get peace. You are not the man they say you are," she said fiercely. "I had a gun pointed at a man's heart tonight. He said, and I wanted to pull the trigger. That is who I am. You are the man who stopped," she said. "You are the man who saved me." They fell into a restless sleep, holding onto each other as if the bed were a raft in a violent sea. Dawn came too soon. It brought a gray, unforgiving light that leaked through the broken window. Caleb woke with a start. He looked at the window and swore softly. "I have to go," he said, sitting up. "If they find me here, if Pike sees—" He dressed quickly, his movements sharp and efficient. He buckled his gun belt, the weight of it settling back onto his hips like a curse. Evelyn sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. She looked pale, her hair wild, her lips swollen from their kissing. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice small. Caleb paused at the door. He looked back at her, and the expression on his face was one of agonizing love. "Try and stop me," he said. He slipped out into the cold morning, but the snow was a traitor. As he rode back toward the double bar, the tracks of his horse were clear, deep, and undeniable. They led straight from the widow's door. Harlan Pike stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching through a brass spyglass. He saw the rider coming from the south. He saw the tracks. He smiled, a cold, victorious expression. At the same moment, in the sheriff's office in town, the telegraph machine began to click. The sheriff tore the strip of paper from the machine. He read it, his eyebrows raising. Confirmation. Caleb Ryder wanted for murder of Marshal Samuel Tate, Abilene, Texas, 1878. Reward $500, dead or alive. The sheriff folded the paper and placed it in his vest pocket. He walked to the gun rack and unlocked the cabinet, taking down a double-barreled shotgun. Evelyn woke alone in the cold cabin. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold on to the lingering warmth of Caleb's body. She felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, beautiful thing that whispered that she was not broken, that she was capable of love. But as she looked at the shattered window and the jagged glass on the floor, a deeper, darker fear settled in her gut. The town had tried to break them apart with fear, and it had failed. Now, she knew, they would come with something stronger than stones. They would not allow this love to exist. The war had begun. The winter broke not with a whimper, but with a groan. The thaw began in late February, turning the valley into a muddy, treacherous purgatory. The roads became rivers of slurry that could swallow a wagon wheel to the axle. The creek, choked with ice melt, roared against its banks, threatening to tear away the few remaining fences. The world was messy, unstable, and dangerous, a perfect reflection of the storm raging inside Evelyn Ward and Caleb Ryder. Caleb was mending a bridle in the double-bar tack room when the door opened. The light was gray and thin, silhouetting the heavy frame of Sheriff Miller. Behind him stood Harlan Pike, smoking a cigar that smelled of money and malice. Miller didn't waste time. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and smoothed it out on a bale of hay. It was a wanted poster. The sketch was crude, but the description was precise. Scar on left cheek, expert marksman. Wanted for the murder of Marshal Samuel Tate. We got a problem. Ryder, Miller said, his voice deceptively casual. Or should I say, Mr. McCrae. Caleb didn't look at the paper. He didn't need to. He kept his eyes on the bridle in his hands, though his knuckles had turned white. My name is Ryder, he said evenly. The sheriff chuckled. Texas says different. Texas says you are a man with a $500 price on his head. That is a lot of money. Son, enough to make a lawman overlook a few details. Or pay attention to them. Pike stepped forward, ash falling from his cigar onto the clean dirt floor. The sheriff is in a bind. Caleb, Pike said. He has a duty to the law, but I told him you are a good hand. I told him maybe there is a way to resolve this without iron bars. Caleb looked up then, meeting Pike's gaze. He saw the trap closing. What do you want? Caleb asked. I want you gone. Pike said. By sundown tomorrow. You pack your roll. You get on your horse, and you ride north. You don't say goodbye to anyone, especially not the widow Ward. And if I don't, then I arrest you for murder, the sheriff said. I put you in chains and send you back to Abilene. And while you are rotting in a cell waiting for the hangman, Mrs. Ward will be sent to the asylum in Carson City. Without you here to play hero, there is no one to stop us. The threat was surgically precise. It targeted the only thing Caleb cared about more than his own freedom. I will misplace the poster, Pike said softly. If you disappear, just walk away. Ryder, you are good at running. Do what you do best. The ride to Evelyn's homestead that evening was the longest of Caleb's life. The mud sucked at his horse's hooves, each step a struggle. He didn't go inside. He couldn't. He sat on his horse by the gate. Looking at the house, he saw Evelyn's shadow moving past the window. She was pacing. He thought about the darkness inside him. He thought about the man he had killed in Texas, not the marshal, but the innocent bystander caught in the crossfire his brother had died trying to stop. He was poison. Pike was right. He was a wanted man, a killer, a drifter with blood on his hands. If he stayed, he would drag Evelyn down with him. The town would use him to destroy her. If he left, she would be alone, but she would be free of the taint of his name. Maybe, if he was gone, Pike would lose interest. Maybe the town would forget. He turned his horse away. Inside the cabin, Evelyn stopped pacing. She had heard the hoofbeats. She had waited for the knock. It never came. She went to the window and looked out. The road was empty, save for the fresh, churning tracks in the mud. He had been there, and he had left. The silence of the house crashed down on her. It was louder than the wind. Why hadn't he come in? Was he tired of her? Was the town right? Was she too broken to love? The anxiety that had been a low hum for weeks spiked into a scream. She checked the door. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It wasn't enough. The campaign to commit Evelyn escalated with terrifying speed. Reverend Clay was methodical. He moved through the town like a grim reaper, collecting signatures on a petition for the involuntary commitment of Evelyn Ward for the protection of the public welfare. He visited the shopkeepers, the ranch wives, the church elders. She is unstable, he told Mrs. Henderson over tea, a danger to herself. She hallucinates. He told the blacksmith, she sees fire where there is none. It is for her own good, he told the school teacher. She needs professional help. The signatures accumulated. To Evelyn, who ventured into town only once to buy kerosene, the atmosphere had shifted from mockery to a terrifying, pitying silence. People didn't jeer anymore. They looked at her with the solemnity of funeral attendees. Then the summons came. The sheriff delivered it personally. A hearing was set for Friday at the town hall. A judge from the circuit court was passing through, and he would hear the petition. You better be there. Mrs. Ward, the sheriff said, handing her the paper. And don't try to run. We will be watching the roads. Things could get ugly if you fight this, he added, pausing at the door. Easier if you just go along with it. The asylum ain't so bad. 3 meals a day. No worries. Evelyn held the paper until her fingers went numb. The walls of the cabin seemed to tilt inward. They were going to lock her up. They were going to put her in a room with bars and throw away the key. She would die in there, screaming in the dark. Caleb stood by the river, 5 miles upstream from the town. The water was brown and violent, churning with ice and debris. He picked up a stone and threw it. It splashed and disappeared instantly. He felt like a wolf with its leg in a trap. Every option led to pain. If he stayed, he would be arrested, and Evelyn would be committed. If he left, he would be free, but Evelyn would be committed. There was no winning. Pike held all the cards. He looked at his hands. They were large, capable hands. They could rope a steer, break a horse, mend a fence. But they couldn't fix this. They couldn't fix the past. You are a coward, he whispered to the rushing water. You are running again. He thought of Evelyn's face the night of the storm, the way she had looked at him, with trust, with hope. She was the only person in 6 years who had looked at him and seen a man, not a murderer. He threw another stone. It hit a patch of ice and skittered across the surface before sinking. He couldn't leave her, even if it meant hanging, even if it meant prison. He couldn't leave her to face those wolves alone. Thursday night, the eve of the hearing. Evelyn was unraveling. The cabin was dark. She hadn't lit the lamp because she was afraid the light would attract them. She sat on the floor in the corner, her arms wrapped around her legs, rocking rhythmically. Her mind was a projector playing her worst fears on a loop. She saw the asylum. It was a stone building with no windows. She saw men in white coats holding her down. She saw straps on her wrists. She heard the sound of the door locking, clack, 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 forever. I am broken, she whispered into the darkness. I am broken. I am broken. She heard a horse outside, then footsteps on the porch, heavy, deliberate steps. She didn't move. If she was quiet, maybe they would go away. Maybe it was the sheriff coming to take her early. The door opened. It wasn't locked. She had forgotten to check it. A silhouette filled the frame. Evelyn? It was Caleb. He stepped inside and closed the door. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light making Evelyn flinch. He lit the lamp on the table. The golden light flooded the room, revealing Evelyn huddled in the corner, her hair matted, her eyes wide and feral. Caleb's heart broke. It cracked right down the center. He had come to say goodbye. He had planned to tell her he was leaving to protect her, but seeing her like this, reduced to a terrified animal in her own home, shattered his resolve instantly. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her. "Evelyn," he said gently. She didn't look at him. She stared at the wall. "They are coming. Caleb, tomorrow. They are going to put me in a box." "No," he said. "Look at me." He reached out and took her face in his hands. His palms were warm, rough, real. He forced her to look at him. "I am not going to let them take you," he said. "You can't stop them," she whispered. "You are just one man, and you have been pulling away. I saw you leave. I saw the tracks. You don't want me anymore. I'm too much trouble." Caleb closed his eyes for a second, pain etching deep lines around his mouth. "I wasn't pulling away because I didn't want you," he said, his voice thick. "I was pulling away because I am dangerous to you." He took a breath, opening his eyes. They were dark and wet with unshed tears. "I have to tell you the truth. All of it." He told her. He told her about the wanted poster. He told her about the deal Pike offered, his freedom for her abandonment. He told her about the shooting in Abilene, sparing no detail of his own guilt. "I am a wanted man. Evelyn, if I stay, they might arrest me. They might hang me. Pike has the sheriff in his pocket." Evelyn listened, her rocking slowing. She looked at this man, this big, scarred, terrified man, kneeling on her floor, offering her his darkest secrets like a handful of jagged glass. He wasn't leaving her because he didn't love her. He was leaving her because he loved her too much to ruin her. "So I have a choice," Caleb said, his voice shaking. "And so do you. I can walk out that door right now. I can ride north, and Pike will leave me alone. You can try to fight them on your own." He paused, swallowing hard. "Or you can ask me to stay, and I will stand next to you tomorrow. I will face the sheriff. I will face Pike. I will probably end up in cuffs, but I won't let you face them alone." Evelyn looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, not fear of the law, but fear of her rejection. She reached out and touched the scar on his cheek. "You would stay?" she whispered. "Knowing they might hang you, I would stay," he said. "Why? Because," he said, his voice breaking, "looking at you is the only time I don't feel like I am damned." Evelyn let out a sob. It was a sound of release, of a dam breaking. "Stay," she breathed. "Please, Caleb, stay. I can't stop thinking about you. You are the only thing that makes my mind feel like it isn't a graveyard. When you are here, the fire goes out." The confession hung in the air, raw and shimmering. Caleb let out a shuddering breath. He leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of comfort. It was a kiss of reclamation. He kissed her slowly, deliberately, as if he were memorizing the shape of her mouth, the taste of her breath. He kissed her eyelids, her cheeks, the pulse at her throat. Evelyn clung to him. She ran her hands over his shoulders, down his back, needing to feel the solidity of him. The fear of the asylum, the fear of the town, it all receded, pushed back by the sheer, overwhelming reality of his presence. They moved together, not to the bed, but just holding each other on the floor, surrounded by the shadows. The emotional heat in the room climbed. It was a desperate, clawing need to be close, to merge, to be so entangled that the town couldn't tear them apart without destroying them both. "I love you," Evelyn whispered against his neck. The words were a vow, a weapon. Caleb pulled back. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He unbuttoned the top of his shirt, exposing the scars on his chest, old bullet wounds, knife marks, the map of a violent life. "Ask me," he said softly. "Ask me about them." Evelyn traced a jagged white line over his ribs. "This one?" she asked. "Bar fight in Dodge City." He said, "Bottleneck." She traced a round puckered scar near his collarbone. "And this?" "Cheyenne Arrow, 1874. She placed her hand flat over his heart, covering the invisible scars that lay beneath. "And this one?" she asked softly, looking into his eyes. He covered her hand with his own. "That one is new," he said. "That one has your name on it." They stayed like that for hours, whispering in the dark. 2 soldiers in a foxhole the night before the battle. They stripped away the last of their defenses. There were no secrets left, no shame, just the terrifying, beautiful truth of who they were. When dawn broke, gray and cold, Caleb stood up. He helped Evelyn to her feet. He smoothed her hair. He buttoned his coat, covering the scars. He checked his gun belt, not to use it, but because it was part of him. "Are you ready?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the door. She was terrified. Her hands were shaking. But then she looked at Caleb. He was standing there, solid as a mountain, waiting for her. "No," she said, "but I am going anyway." The town hall was packed. Every bench was full. The air smelled of damp wool, sawdust, and judgment. The circuit judge sat at a heavy table at the front of the room. He was a tired-looking man with spectacles and a gray beard. Sheriff Miller stood to his right. Harlan Pike sat in the front row, looking smug. Reverend Clay stood near the window, his Bible clutched in his hand like a stone. When the doors opened and Evelyn walked in, a hush fell over the room. She walked down the center aisle. She wore her best black dress, brushed and mended. Her head was high, though her face was pale as milk. And beside her, matching her step for step, was Caleb Ryder. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pike's eyes narrowed. The sheriff put his hand on his gun butt. They took their seats at the small table facing the judge. The hearing began. It was a slaughter. Reverend Clay spoke first. He painted a picture of a woman possessed. He spoke of her public outbursts, her screaming in the street, her refusal to integrate into the flock. "She is a danger to the moral fabric of this town," Clay intoned. "A woman who cannot control her own mind is a fire waiting to consume us all." Then Pike spoke. He lied smoothly, with the confidence of a man who owned the truth. "She wanders onto my property at night, Judge, confused, disoriented. My men found her near a burning shed. She is fascinated by fire. It is a compulsion. We fear she will burn the whole valley down if left unchecked." The judge looked at Evelyn over his spectacles. "Mrs. Ward, do you have anything to say to these accusations?" Evelyn opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat seized. She looked at the faces in the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith, the women who pulled their skirts away. They were all looking at her with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. She felt the room begin to spin. The smell of the sawdust became the smell of smoke. Then Caleb stood up. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a whip crack. The judge frowned. "Who are you? My name is Caleb Ryder," he said. "I work for Mr. Pike, and I am a friend of Mrs. Ward." "Friend?" Pike scoffed loudly. "He is her paramour, judge, and a man of questionable character." Caleb ignored him. He looked straight at the judge. "They say she is dangerous." Caleb said, "They say she is unstable, but I was there the night of the barn incident. I was the one who found her." He turned to look at the crowd, meeting the eyes of the men who had ridden around her house that night. She wasn't wandering. He said she was being hunted. 5 men rode around her house, throwing rocks, shouting threats. They terrorized a woman living alone. They tried to break her. A gasp went through the room. "And I nearly shot one of them," Caleb continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I pulled my gun. I was ready to kill." He looked at his hands, then back at the judge. "Does that make me unstable, Judge? Does that make me a danger? Or does it make me a man reacting to cruelty?" He pointed at Evelyn, who was staring at him, tears standing in her eyes. "She has scars, Your Honor, just like a soldier coming back from a war. When a soldier flinches at a loud noise, we give him a medal. When she does it, they want to lock her in a cage. Her episodes aren't evil. They are wounds. She is bleeding, and this town is just throwing salt in the cut." Silence. Absolute silence. The sheriff stepped forward, his face red. "Your Honor, this man is wanted for murder in Texas." He blurted out, "I have the wire right here. He is a killer trying to sweet-talk this court." The room erupted. "Murderer! Killer!" The judge banged his gavel. "Order! Order!" The sheriff slapped the wanted poster on the judge's table. Caleb didn't move. He didn't run. He stood his ground, looking at Evelyn. "It is true," Caleb said, his voice rising above the noise. "I am wanted, but I am here. I am standing here because she is worth it." The judge looked from the poster to Caleb, then to Evelyn. He looked at Pike, whose smugness had turned to rage. The sheriff moved toward Caleb, pulling a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "That is enough," Miller said. "Hands behind your back. Ryder." Evelyn saw the metal glint. The panic that had been building in her chest exploded. They were taking him. They were going to take him away, and then they were going to take her. Her hands began to shake violently. She started to rock in her chair. The room was dissolving into a tunnel of noise and hostility. She was slipping. The fire was coming. Caleb saw it. He saw her eyes losing focus. He saw the dissociation taking hold. "Wait!" Caleb shouted. He ignored the sheriff. He reached out, right there in front of God, the judge, and the entire town of Silver Creek. He took Evelyn's hand. It was a simple gesture, but in that room, charged with hate and judgment, it was an act of revolution. "Evelyn," he said, his voice cutting through the noise in her head. "Evelyn, hold on to me." He squeezed her hand hard, grounding her. "Don't go back there," he said intently. "Stay here. Stay with me." Evelyn gasped, her eyes snapping to his. She felt his calloused skin against hers. She felt the warmth of his blood. She fought. For the first time, she fought the flashback with everything she had. She used his touch as an anchor, dragging herself back from the edge of the abyss. She squeezed his hand back, her fingers interlaced with his, gripping him with the strength of a drowning woman. She looked at the sheriff, then at Pike, then at the judge. She was shaking, terrified, and surrounded by enemies. But her hand was in Caleb's, and he wasn't letting go. "I am here," she whispered, her voice trembling but audible. "I am here." The courtroom was a crucible, heating up with the friction of judgment and fear. The air grew stifling, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. Evelyn Ward sat frozen in her chair. The sheriff stood mere feet away, the iron handcuffs dangling from his belt like a promise of containment. The room was narrowing. The faces of the townsfolk, Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith, the ranch hands, began to blur into a singular, hostile entity. The walls seemed to pulse, inching closer with every beat of her heart. In the corners of her vision, the shadows lengthened and twisted. They looked like smoke. The murmur of the crowd sounded like the crackling of dry timber. "They know," the voice in her head whispered. "They know you are wicked. They know you let him burn." She felt the familiar slide. The floor was dropping away. She was falling back into the night that had defined her life for 3 years. Then, a pressure on her hand. It was not a gentle touch. It was a grip of iron. "Evelyn." Caleb's voice was low, rough, and right beside her ear. He had leaned in, ignoring the judge, ignoring the sheriff who was stepping forward to restrain him. He turned his body to shield her from the room, creating a small, private world in the middle of the chaos. "Look at the table." "Evelyn," Caleb said, his thumb digging into the back of her hand, anchoring her to the physical world. "Look at the grain of the wood. It is oak. It is solid. You are here. You are in Silver Creek. It is 1881. Evelyn blinked, forcing her eyes to focus on the scratches in the table's varnish. "Oak. Solid. You are not in the fire," Caleb continued, his voice a steady drumbeat against her panic. "You are holding my hand. My name is Caleb. I am the man who pulled you out of the street. I am the man who loves you." A gasp went through the room at the word love. It was a word rarely spoken in courtrooms, and never by a drifter to a madwoman. "You are not made of fire." "Evelyn," he whispered fiercely. "You are made of strength. You survived. Thomas loved you. He knew you tried. He knew." The mention of her son's name pierced the fog. The smoke in her mind dissipated, replaced by the sharp, stinging clarity of the present. She looked up at Caleb. His eyes were dark, terrified, and full of a fierce, protective light. He was exposing himself, his heart, his vulnerability, to a room full of people who wanted to hang him, just to keep her from drowning. She squeezed his hand back. She took a breath. It rattled in her chest, but it filled her lungs. She stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. The sheriff paused, his hand hovering near his gun. The judge adjusted his spectacles, surprised by the sudden movement. Evelyn did not let go of Caleb's hand. She held it like a lifeline. "I want to speak," she said. Her voice was thin, shaking like a leaf in a gale, but it was audible. "Mrs. Ward," the judge said, looking over his glasses. "You are not required to—" "I want to speak," she cried out, the volume surprising even her. She turned to face the room. She saw the pity in Mrs. Miller's eyes. She saw the hard satisfaction in Harlan Pike's jaw. She saw Reverend Clay clutching his Bible like a weapon. "You tell stories about me," she began, her voice trembling. "You whisper in the store. You say I sat on the porch and watched. You say I was drunk. You say I'm crazy." Tears spilled over her lashes, hot and fast, tracking through the dust on her face. "You don't know," she sobbed. "You don't know what happened that night." She took a shuddering breath, her grip on Caleb's hand tightening until her knuckles turned white. "My husband, Jed, he was a hard man. He drank. When the drought came, he drank more. That night, he came home angry. The money was gone. He wanted more whiskey." She looked down at her boots, unable to meet the eyes of the crowd. "We fought. He threw a bottle. It missed me. It hit the wall. The lamp. The lamp was on the table. We struggled. I pushed him. He fell against the table. The lamp went over. The room was deadly silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. The oil, it went everywhere." She stammered, the words tumbling out now. "A dam breaking. The flames went up the curtain so fast, faster than you can think. I tried to put it out. I threw a quilt, but it was too hot." She looked up, her eyes wide and haunted, seeing the memory playing out in the air before her. "I ran to the bedroom, to Thomas. He was crying, 'Mama, it's hot.' I heard him. I got to the door, but the roof beam came down. It blocked the door. I pushed it until my hands burned." She held up her hands, showing the faint, silvery scars on her palms that she usually kept hidden. "I screamed for Jed to help me, but he was passed out in the kitchen. The smoke, I couldn't breathe. I crawled out the window. I tried to go back in. I tried. But the whole house, it was just a wall of fire." She broke down then, her body racking with sobs that were ugly and raw. She wasn't the stoic, silent widow anymore. She was a mother screaming her grief. "I lived," she shrieked, the sound tearing at the throat of every person in the room. "I stood in the snow, and I lived while my baby burned. That is my sin. Not that I started it, but that I survived it." She collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, shaking uncontrollably. The courtroom was stunned. The silence was heavy, suffocating. The simple, brutal truth of domestic violence and a tragic accident hung in the air, stripping away the supernatural madness the Reverend had preached about. Mrs. Henderson, in the second row, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. The blacksmith looked down at his boots, his face flushing red. It was easy to hate a witch. It was much harder to hate a grieving mother who had been beaten by her husband and broken by fate. Harlan Pike shifted in his seat, scowling. This was not going according to plan. The sympathy in the room was shifting. "But he is still a killer," Pike shouted, pointing a thick finger at Caleb. "She may be a victim, but he is a fugitive. He is wanted for murder." All eyes turned to Caleb. He was still standing, his hand resting on Evelyn's shoulder, offering comfort even as the target shifted to him. Caleb looked at the judge. He didn't flinch. "It is true," Caleb said. His voice was flat, resigned. He let go of Evelyn's shoulder and took a step forward, separating his fate from hers. 1878. "Abilene, I was 22. I was wild. I thought being a man meant being fast with a gun. He looked at his hands. The hands that had mended Evelyn's fence. The hands that had held her through the storm. We were in a saloon. A man insulted me. I don't even remember what he said. It didn't matter. I was proud. I drew my iron. Caleb swallowed hard, the Adam's apple in his throat bobbing. My brother, Seth, he was younger, better than me. He tried to stop it. He stepped in. He put his hand on my arm, but I had already pulled the trigger. The other man shot back, but it was my bullet, or his. I don't know. The smoke was thick, but Seth went down. He looked up at the crowd, his eyes dry but burning with an ancient pain. He died in the sawdust. I ran. I have been running for 3 years, not from the law, from his face, from the knowledge that I killed the only person who ever gave a damn about me. He looked down at Evelyn, who was watching him with tear-streaked eyes. I thought I was damned, Caleb said softly. I thought I deserved to be alone, until I met her. She is the only thing I have found that is worth stopping for. He turned to the sheriff and held out his wrists. If you are going to arrest me, Miller, do it. But leave her be. She has paid enough. The sheriff stared at Caleb. He looked at the handcuffs in his own hand. He looked at Pike, who was nodding vigorously, demanding action. Then he looked at the crowd. The town was divided. The fear was still there. A wanted man was a dangerous thing. But there was also something else. Respect. It was the reluctant respect of hard people for someone who stood up and owned his dirt. I need a recess, the sheriff stammered. I need to confer with the judge. Court is in recess for 1 hour, the judge barked, banging his gavel. The room erupted into noise. Caleb sat down heavily beside Evelyn. He didn't look at her. He stared at the table, waiting for the end. Evelyn reached out and took his hand again. She didn't say anything. She just held on. They were allowed to step outside, under the watchful eye of the sheriff's deputy. They stood on the steps of the town hall. The wind was biting, carrying the scent of melting snow and mud. The land stretched out before them, vast, indifferent, beautiful in its cruelty. The distant hills were brown and gray, capped with white. The sky was a pale, hard blue. It doesn't care, does it? Evelyn said softly, looking at the horizon. The land. It doesn't care if we are guilty or innocent. No, Caleb said. It just cares if we can survive the winter. He looked at her. Whatever happens in there, Evelyn, I don't regret it. I don't regret stopping. I know, she said. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, 2 small figures against the immense scale of the West. They knew that the world beyond the town limits offered no mercy, but it also offered no judgment. It just was. The hour passed. They were called back in. The judge sat behind the table, his face stern. Harlan Pike looked agitated, his face red, as if he had been arguing and lost. The court has reached a decision, the judge announced. Evelyn held her breath. Caleb's jaw tightened, regarding Mrs. Evelyn Ward. The judge said, "The petition for involuntary commitment is denied." Evelyn let out a sob, her knees buckling. Caleb caught her arm, holding her up. However, the judge continued, raising a finger, the court recognizes that Mrs. Ward is fragile. Therefore, she will be placed under the informal guardianship of the church. Reverend Clay will check on her weekly. Any further public disturbances, any further incidents involving fire, and this court will reconsider the asylum. Do you understand, Mrs. Ward? Yes, Evelyn whispered. Yes, Your Honor. It was not freedom. It was a leash, but it was better than a cage. As for you, Mr. Ryder, the judge said, turning his cold gaze on Caleb. Pike leaned forward, grinning. The sheriff has confirmed the warrant, the judge said. However, the sheriff has also noted that the jurisdiction in Texas has not sent the extradition funds. And frankly, this county does not have the budget to transport you 500 miles. The judge paused. You are free to go, Mr. Ryder, but you are on a very short tether. You will remain employed at the Double Bar, under protest from Mr. Pike. I understand. But we need the labor in the valley. If you step one toe out of line, if you so much as spit on the sidewalk, Sheriff Miller will chain you up and walk you to Texas himself. Do you understand?" "I understand," Caleb said, his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Then get out of my courtroom," the judge said. "Both of you. It was a compromise born of bureaucracy and cowardice. It was unjust. It was humiliating. But they were walking out the front door, and they were doing it together. The walk back to the homestead was quiet. The road was a slurry of mud and ice, making every step a labor. They didn't touch. The eyes of the town were still on them, watching from behind lace curtains and shop windows. They passed the spot where the wagon had nearly crushed Evelyn months ago. They passed the alley where Caleb had stared down the drunks. The town felt different now. It wasn't a home. It was a place they had survived. When they finally reached Evelyn's land, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. The cabin looked small and frail, leaning into the wind. It felt like a prison, but it also felt like the only place on earth where they could breathe. Caleb didn't ride back to the ranch. He tied his horse to the rail. He picked up the axe from the stump. "I will get some wood," he said. Evelyn nodded. "I will check the roof. The wind was hard last night. They worked. It was a silent, stubborn defiance. They fixed the things that could be fixed. They mended the fence. They chopped the wood. They performed the ordinary, mundane tasks of living, as if to tell the universe that they expected to be there tomorrow, and the day after that." When the chores were done, they went inside. The cabin was cold. Evelyn lit the stove. She didn't hesitate this time. She struck the match and watched the flame catch the kindling. It was just fire. It was heat. It wasn't a monster. They sat on the rug in front of the stove, the only light coming from the open grate. Caleb leaned back against the wall, stretching his long legs out. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes were deep. Evelyn moved to sit beside him. She rested her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I am still afraid," she confessed quietly into the silence. "Of what?" Caleb asked, resting his chin on her hair. "Of waking up tomorrow and not knowing where I am. Of the fog coming back. The judge said, 'If I have another episode, we will handle it,' Caleb said. 'If the fog comes, I will be the lighthouse. I will find you.'" He shifted, looking down at his hands. "I am afraid too," he admitted. "You?" Evelyn looked up at him. "I felt it today, in the courtroom. When Pike was talking, I wanted to hurt him. The anger, it is right there, under the skin. I'm afraid that one day I won't be able to stop it. And then I will lose you." Evelyn reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "You stopped in the snow," she reminded him. "You stopped today. You are not the man who pulled the trigger in Abilene. You are the man who held my hand while I told the truth." She leaned in and kissed him. It was a slow kiss. It tasted of salt and fatigue and a desperate, aching tenderness. It wasn't the frantic collision of the blizzard night. It was the kiss of two people who had fought a war and were tending each other's wounds. There was hunger in it. Yes, a deep, thrumming need to feel and be felt, but it was tempered by the fragility of their situation. They were living on borrowed time, and every touch felt like a stolen treasure. "I can't stop thinking about you," Evelyn whispered against his lips. She pulled back to look at him, her blue eyes wide and searching in the firelight. "Even when the panic starts, even when I smell the smoke, I think of your voice. I think of you standing in the barn. It is like a rope thrown into the dark. I grab it, and I know I can climb out." Caleb closed his eyes, overwhelmed. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing her in. "When I look at this land," he murmured, his voice vibrating against her collarbone. "The rocks, the wind, the way the river cuts through the stone. It is hard. It is unforgiving." He lifted his head and looked at her. "But then I see you. I see you standing up in that court. I see you checking that door 3 times because you refuse to let the bad things in. You are just as stubborn as this land. Evelyn, you are broken. Maybe, but you are still standing." He kissed her forehead. "That stubbornness, it is the only thing that has ever made sense to me. It is the only religion I have left." They sat there as the fire burned down to embers, holding each other against the encroaching dark. "So what do we do?" Evelyn asked. "We stay," Caleb said, "for now. We finish the winter. We work. We let the town talk. And if they come for us again, if Pike tries to trap you, then we ride," Caleb said simply. "We pack the mules. We cross the mountains. We go where they can't find us. Together, together." 2 weeks later, the snow was almost gone. The valley was turning green, a hesitant, vibrant emerald pushing up through the mud. Caleb and Evelyn rode out to the far edge of her property line. They sat on their horses side by side, watching the sun lower over the Sierra Nevadas. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, streaked with gold. The wind was cold, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Evelyn looked at the horizon. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of her mind like a shadow. She knew the nightmares would come back. She knew the town would never truly accept her. She looked at Caleb. He sat easy in the saddle, his eyes scanning the distance, always watching for danger. The past was still chasing him. The warrant was still in a drawer in the sheriff's office. They were not safe. They were not healed in the way the storybooks promised. They were scarred, hunted, and living on the edge of a knife. But as the wind kicked up, tossing the manes of their horses, Caleb reached out. Evelyn took his hand. His grip was rough, warm, and solid. They sat there, hand in hand, facing the wild, indifferent West. They were two broken things that had found a way to fit together. And in the vast silence of the frontier, the steady beat of their hearts sounded like a defiance, a warm, rough-handed promise that as long as they had this, as long as they had each other, they would survive the night. Thank you for listening to this story. Writing Evelyn and Caleb's journey through the harsh beauty of the American West has been a journey in itself. I hope you felt the dust, the cold, and the stubborn hope of their love. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the city, the country, or somewhere wild yourself? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did Evelyn and Caleb make the right choice to stay? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of survival, grit, and romance on the frontier. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry.